I'd like to introduce you to Anne Gerber, our next presenter. Anne is the Senior Software Engineering for the AustESE, is that it? AustESE project, developing research tools to support the collaborative authoring and management of electronic scholarly editions. She's also part of the Open Annotation Collection, developing annotation tools and services that can be used to evaluate and demonstrate the applicability of OAC data model in the context of annotation supporting collaborative development of scholarly editions. From July 2008 to July 2011, Anna was the Senior Software Engineering at AustESE project. I like the names of the projects. She had previously worked on the Harvanum, harvesting and aggregating network annotations, and Crest for PyMol projects, prior to joining the eResearch group at the University of Queensland, the School of Information Technology and Electrical Engineering. Anna was a research scientist at the AustESE from 2000 to 2005, focusing on enterprise modeling. Please help me welcome Anna to the stage.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do today is to give you an overview of the AustESE project. That's the Australian Electronic Scholarly Editing Project, which we're working on at the moment. It's a Nectar-funded project, one of the eResearch Tools projects being led at the University of Queensland. But it's a collaboration between the University of Queensland, the University of New South Wales at ADFA, the University of Sydney, Curtin University, and QUT in Queensland, as well as we have international collaborators from Loyola University in Chicago and the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. So as I mentioned, it's funded by Nectar, and we're very pleased to and proud to be involved with the Nectar eResearch Tools program. So the objectives of the AustESE project are to develop a workbench, basically. So we wanted to aim to support the scholarly editing workflow, to provide tools that could be used in a Web 2.0 environment in order to support the research needs of the Australian scholarly editing community. And the way that we've chosen to do that is to develop an online workbench that integrates a number of existing open source tools that were already available, that had been developed independently by a number of different scholarly editing projects, and to fill in the gaps by developing the missing pieces and to tie that together with workflow support and an integrated model. So for those of you who are perhaps not familiar with what I mean by scholarly editing, we're primarily concerned with scholarly editing of literature. So scholarly editions aim to provide a detailed study of a work of significance, whether it's a work of fiction, whether it's a work of, say, philosophical or religious significance. It might be a collection of important letters. It might be journals or notebooks from a voyage or from some person of significance. So the types of scholarly editions that we're working with are primarily textual, and they also might have images, facsimile images of the scanned pages of text. But there are also other scholarly editions in other disciplines, such as music, for example, that could potentially be supported by the system that we're developing with a little bit of extension. So when we talk about a literary scholarly edition, these typically contain not only the original materials under study, but also significant historical and contextual essays that give us information about the significance of that work and the environment in which it was developed and the impact it's had. A textual essay that describes how the work has changed over time. So in the case of literature, there may have been manuscript versions that were significantly altered by the author through the course of their life, altered by editors, and then subsequently abridged or altered through censorship or other processes such as introduction of errors, scribal errors, and so forth through publication. So these Scholarly editions not only contain those essays, but they also contain a lot of annotations in the form of explanatory notes and other notes that provide geographical information and contextual information. Appendices such as glossaries, and sometimes they might be very specific to the domain. For example, if you have a scholarly edition of a nautical journal, you might have appendices that describe nautical terms and describe some of the significant information that was contained in that journal. And in the literary variorum editions, we also have a scholarly apparatus that describes in very minute detail the exact changes between each version of those texts to provide alternate readings of the work, so that if you're interested in how, say, Shakespeare's Hamlet looked in the 1600s, you can go and look at that apparatus and see exactly how it's changed over time. So just to give you an example, this is a scan of a page. I apologise that it's so tiny, but you can see at the top you've got kind of the original text, and down at the bottom you've got a list of footnotes that describe the variations. So this is an example of a variorum edition, and variorum is where you describe those textual variations in a lot of detail. But there are also other types of scholarly editions. So this is an example of a commentary or an annotated edition. So in this case, they're not concerned with describing the variorum in detail, but they've chosen one version of that work, and then they're providing significant annotations, providing commentary and background information on terms and information that's contained in that work. And of course, you can put that together. You can have variorum, and you can have annotation, and you have a critical edition. The examples that I just showed you were from print editions, and traditionally that's the form that publication has taken in scholarly editing. But we have seen a number of electronic editions since about the early 90s. Electronic editions have been being developed, first of all on CD-ROM and then later online. And this is a screenshot from Herman Melville's Typee, which is one of the online editions. So there have been tools that have been developed by these projects, but typically they've been kind of fragmented efforts. There might be a tool that does one piece of the workflow, or the tools might be proprietary, or they're quite out of date now, legacy tools that need to be integrated. There hasn't really been a project that has looked at supporting the entire scholarly editing workflow and tying all those tools together in an end-to-end system. But there are certainly significant online editions that I should mention, such as the William Blake Archive and the Rossetti Archive, the Mark Twain Project, for example, and also the Samuel Beckett Digital Manuscript Project, which are held up as being really great examples. So we're not doing something totally new, but what we are doing is trying to support the tools and better than has been done in these previous projects. The other thing that these projects don't do is, well, typically they've been bespoke tools, bespoke solutions developed for that particular project, and tools haven't seen a lot of reuse outside of that project. So what we'd like to do is to try to facilitate interoperability of the tools and reuse of those tools, and particularly providing open source tools at other projects. So if you were developing an online edition, you could take our tools and customize it. Okay. So in order to do this, we propose developing a workbench, a scholarly editing workbench, which is a web-based workbench. And I'll talk through each piece of this architecture. We've identified these main categories of tools that are required to support the scholarly editing workflow. So we have text import and markup tools, which is where you kind of get the original materials and scan them in, digitize them and load them up. Text and image alignment in order to kind of line up the transcriptions that have been created either manually or through OCR with the images that have been scanned from the original manuscripts and publications. Collation and textual analysis tools, collaborative annotation, tagging, and electronic edition publishing. And as I said, I'll talk through each one of these. So the text import and markup tools, typically people are using TEI XML to represent transcriptions, but we do support other formats as well, such as plain text. And the tools that we're developing, or that we have developed so far, allow you to import these digital resources that are essentially digital surrogates for the original artifacts that are being studied. and then to edit or correct the transcriptions or make minor changes to the images such as rotation. And also, of course, to enter metadata for each one of these artifacts. The text and image alignment tools are for aligning the images and the transcriptions that have been created from those images. At the moment, this is a screenshot of our prototype, which is a manual alignment tool. But there is a tool that's being developed by Desmond Schmidt, who was formerly at QUT, which actually does automatic recognition of lines, words, and pages in manuscript and scanned print images in order to make this process a lot smoother. Collation and textual analysis tools. So the process of collation involves producing the critical apparatus that is used in a scholarly edition. So a detailed study of every version of a particular work and a comparison at, down to the level of punctuation characters, for example. So in a traditional edition, this was used to produce a scholarly apparatus, but we're actually using it to build up a graph of textual variation that can then be visualized in a number of different ways. So this is, I apologize again, it's very small, but this is a table-based view of variation between several versions of King Lear by Shakespeare. You can see the blue text is kind of highlighting the key differences there, and that just continues on for the entire work. This is another view that is built on top of the multi-version document graph that I mentioned, is the variant graph that was developed by Desmond Schmidt. And in this case, you can select at the top two versions that you'd like to see a visual comparison between, and it will highlight in different colors the differences between those two versions. And bearing in mind that these are transcriptions that may actually represent multiple versions themselves, because TI-XML allows you to represent layers of revision, for example, from a manuscript. So this is a lot more complicated than it looks. It's not just diff. Another example of a collation tool is Juxta, which is an open source tool that we're looking at integrating into the workbench, and it provides a similar but slightly different visualization. And I don't know whether you can see it, but there are actually links that are being maintained here visually, so that when you click on one, it will kind of go and align with the next one. And this is important because sometimes you can have transposition where you take one piece of the text and it moves somewhere else completely in the document. So you need to know, oh, that's gone to chapter 7. So as I said, traditionally this collation process was used to produce a critical apparatus, and this is an example of a critical apparatus. We have here a page from Rubbery Underarms, which was a scholarly edition produced by Paul Eggert, who's one of our, well, he's leading our project. This is the text of the edited version. So usually a scholarly edition, a critical edition, will try to establish a reliable version of the text by looking at all of the other versions and then coming up with one that is free from editorial intervention, that's designed to be authoritative. So this is the authoritative text, and you can see down the bottom here, or perhaps you can't, but you'll take my word for it, that these are descriptions of the change. So we've got an example of the name of one of the characters, which was Driver in the authoritative version, but it had changed from Webster in a previous version. We also want to integrate textual analysis tools, such as the Voyant tools that are shown here, that give us lots of different views on the actual content of those versions. So things like word clouds and frequency analysis and collocated words. One of the other categories of tools that we're integrating are the annotation and tagging tools, and these allow editors to attach scholarly commentary in the form of, for example, explanatory notes, but also allow communication between editors and between people who are perhaps studying the work at a later point after the edition has been finalized. So this is just a screenshot of one of our annotation tools that we developed through the Open Annotation Collaboration project, which is one of my other projects that I'm working on. And you can see here we're annotating a comparison view that shows a facsimile and a a transcription and allows you to select the different versions down the side here. So this part here is the annotation tool, and this is the display that's being shown through the browser of the different views of the version. One of the annotation tools that we're integrating is one that we developed for the AustESE project, which was a NEET-funded project. So the law annotation tool was a Firefox extension. It's open source as well. All of the tools that we're developing are open source. So we'll be integrating law into the workbench. So if people prefer to use that rather than the inbuilt annotation tools, that will be possible. And it's available on GitHub, just in case you're interested. And I should mention that our definition of annotation is perhaps a little bit different to what people from the TEI community might be used to. The annotations that we're dealing with are based on the open annotation model, which is an RDF-based annotation model, and all of the annotations are what you might think of as standoff. So they're stored completely separately from the text. They're not embedded, and this gets around a lot of problems with, say, overlapping hierarchies of markup and annotation. To go along with the annotation tool, we've also developed an annotation repository through AustESE and then later extending it through the OAC project called Law Store, and this allows us to store those annotations as RDF and to provide features such as a SPARQL query interface, SPARQL endpoint to query those annotations. We have several different views and formats that are available, all of the different RDF formats, and this is an interactive graph visualization that shows you all of the nodes in the annotation graph. That's useful if you're, say, getting to know the open annotation collaboration model, just for understanding how that model works. There are a number of specialized annotation types that are specific to scholarly editions. So the tools that we've developed so far have been sort of more for generic web annotation. But in a scholarly edition, you've got the textual notes that describe things like the texture variation or the changes of particular words over time. And also lots and lots of different types of explanatory notes. We could explode this out to hundreds of types, describing, for example, all of the different types of allusion, historical notes, bibliographical notes, geographical notes, and then very specialized types of those. So using the open annotation model, which supports RDF and being able to define custom kind of subclasses is really great, because we can kind of treat all of the annotations at a high level as simply annotations, or if we want to, we can go and tag them right down to this very specific level of detail to support advanced querying and filtering of annotations. And the kind of the last piece that was in that architecture diagram is the electronic publishing, which is the tools that we use for versioning, locking, and publishing the editions once they're kind of completed to online formats, to TEI XML, to Microsoft Word, EPUB, etc. So this really depends on the end goal. So a lot of the editions that are being developed will be print editions, and so they'll typically be exported to Word to be sent to publishers because they require Word or TEI XML. But some people just want to produce an online edition, and so exporting it to HTML is also a great option. And we're really interested in exploring tablets and mobile devices and EPUB and some of the really great interactivity you can get through things like the iBooks platform on iPad. So just as a summary of the tools, we did a survey and looked at all of the projects that had been developed over the last, say, 20 to 15 years, and all of the open source tools that were available. And these were the ones that we identified as the ones that we would be looking at for integration. And there are, down the bottom, some pieces that are missing, as I mentioned. So just getting those tools to talk to each other, getting them to work with the kind of the model that we're developing. And particularly text and image alignment, although there was a tool, Tile, from Myth in Maryland, it didn't work particularly well for our use case, and so we've switched to using, Desmond Schmidt at QUT switched to developing his own tool, which we're going to be using. So there are a lot of pieces that still need to be filled in. The way that we're integrating these is based on workflow. So this is an example of the scholarly editing workflow. I know this is small, but basically there's an archiving sort of phase, and there's an editing phase, and the archiving phase involves digitizing and uploading and describing the metadata of the different transcriptions and facsimiles, identifying all of the artifacts under study. And then the editing phase is once you've identified all of those, it's the process of collation and annotation and analysis and preparing the editorial rationale and the essays that go along with the edition. And then sort of at the start and end of that are all of the administrative tasks involved with setting up a project and then publishing the project at the end. And within that workflow, there are lots of different people involved. So typically there'll be a single person who's kind of driving the edition, but they may have many co-editors. There may be students involved. There will be project editors, general editor of the publisher who's actually publishing a series of editions, for example. There'll be people involved in the digitization, so quite often you'll send your originals off to India or somewhere to actually have it keyed in. So those people can also upload directly into the workbench, and there'll be students and reviewers and people just using the edition after it's been published. We're developing the web interface to this workbench using Drupal 7, but with a MongoDB backend. And currently we're supporting OpenID authentication, but later we'll be adding AAF support next year. And this is just a wireframe that shows our workbench interface design. We've developed an ontology that helps us to kind of relate all of the entities involved. It's based very closely on the IFLA functional requirements for bibliographic records, but it's not exactly reusing it because FERBA doesn't really support manuscripts, particularly manuscripts like authors' notebooks where you have many different works, fragments of different versions. You've got layers of revision because you've got bits crossed out, and actually if you extract that you'd have 3 different versions on that page. So our model can map to the FERBA for those entities where it makes sense, such as published works, but it supports manuscripts as well. And it's also based on this multi-version document concept, which is representing a variant graph that Desmond Schmidt came up with. So I also realized that's just kind of to give you an idea of the size of the ontology. These are the key entities from the ontology. So we've got agents, who are the people and the organizations involved in the production of these works, artifacts, which are kind of the original physical manuscripts and books, so kind of correlating to FERBA item, but also allowing manuscripts. Versions and works, which are the way that we kind of organize the conceptual idea of the work above that. We've got the idea of digital surrogates, which are the scans or the transcriptions for the artifacts, and there may be more than one surrogate for a particular artifact. So if you have a manuscript that has many versions because it's got layers of revision, you might have several transcriptions. Digital resources, which are the files that represent those surrogates, and then collections for those resources. So just a very quick example to show you how that model works. Roger Osborne, my colleague at UQ, who is developing an online edition of Joseph Furphy's Such Is Life. The agent involved, one of the agents involved would be Joseph Furphy, the author himself. And then we've also got a number of artifacts, such as there was a manuscript that was handwritten. There were a number of typescripts that Furphy typed up. So we've got scans of those. Some of them are actually pasted on a notebook, a noteboard over in a collection of, there's a museum sort of dedicated to Joseph Furphy. So some of these are not easily digitizable. And then we've got construction of the different versions. So in this case, he rewrote and he removed whole chapters and split his original work into several works. So we've got all of these different relationships between the artifacts and the different works. And in fact, there are missing pieces that we might be able to kind of derive based on, well, we've got this version, and perhaps we can work out what the missing pieces were. So I'm out of time. I'll just show you. I've only got a couple more slides left to go. This is an example of the sorts of visualizations that we intend to develop over the top of that to show the relationships between the artifacts and the versions. Just again, it's all open source development. The project's been running since June of this year. It's running until December next year. We're using an agile development approach. We've got identified a bunch of user stories. We've done some user interaction design, and now we're actually going through the cycles of development. And we're also planning to develop virtual machine images in order to make it easy for researchers to spin up an instance in the Nectar Cloud that has all of the tools on it. So you won't have to be a developer to use these tools. And we hope to enable faster authoring of editions. These have been typically very, very long projects that span, say, a decade or more. So we really want to speed that up and get it happening within the space of a few years, get people sharing their resources, reusing instead of having to digitize things over and over again and annotate them over and over again, and to help the adoption of best practices, particularly for the metadata and the standards of the formats that are being shared. These are the people who are involved in the project. Go to our website if you want a list of those people. Thank you very much.
Sorry, we ran out of time for questions, but Anna is going to be here. Yes. Are you going to be in this stream until the end of the stream? Okay, so maybe the next point in time we can do that. So if you could please help me thank Anna for a really great presentation. Thank you very much.